So welcome to this roundtable on impact of AI on the economy and on work and skills. It's important to recognize the heads of delegation we've got in the room. From Singapore, Dr. Janil Putticherry. From the United Kingdom, Lord Ashton. From Lithuania, Mr. Civilis. And also from Finland, Ms. Anna Kajilian. And also from France, and I think we're still waiting to get the full complement of everybody to show up, but welcome. We also have several experts who are going to participate in this conversation. From South Korea, we've got Mr. Kang Tuko, and then from Singapore, we've got Ms. Jane Lim. We've also got from Estonia, Mr. Andrei Kapichenko, and then we've also got from Sweden, Mr. Todd Hemerson. So thank you. The way we're going to do this, I'll make some remarks for a few minutes, and then we'll go to some of the experts who are going to make some remarks, and then we'll open it up to a dialogue amongst all of us. I'm going to make some brief remarks on the economy, work, and skills. One of the things that is important to recognize is that from an economy standpoint, we've relied a lot for economic growth over the last 50 years from two factors. If you look at the GDP growth we've had over the last 50 years, it's largely been driven by two things: growth in labor supply and productivity growth. If you add that up, that gives you roughly the 3.5% GDP growth we've had over 50 years in roughly the G20 countries. If we look at what this picture looks like over the next 50 years, we know that because of aging and demographics, the labor supply growth is going to come crushing down to being next to nothing, at least in these 20 advanced economies. And so if we assume, for example, that productivity growth continues at the level that it's been for the last 50 years, we will still have much slower economic growth. And this is particularly important when we take into account the fact that if you look at the last, in recent history, productivity growth has actually been very, very sluggish. So it's not even clear we can count on the 1.8% productivity growth that we've had historically to continue over the next 50 years. So this is really, really important. So when we think about the contributions that AI and these automation technologies can provide, a big part of the reason to take that quite seriously is it's one of the ways we think we can make contributions to economic growth, especially in a world in which we can no longer rely in these advanced economies on labor supply growth to contribute to that. So as you may have seen in the plenary session, one of the things I highlighted is that from the work that we and others have been doing, there are various ways in which these technologies are going to contribute to economic growth. A big part of that has to do with some of these labor effects, substitution and complementarities with work. But a bigger part is going to come from innovations in new products and services that are going to enter the economy. We're still going to need to take into account some of the transition costs that have to do mostly with on the labor side and some other negative externalities. But I think the conclusion is that we should come out with a largely net positive contribution economically from these technologies. And in fact, if you look at a combination of these technologies, not just AI, but other digitization technologies, they look like they could contribute quite substantially to the shortfall in productivity growth that we have over the next 50 years. I think the question that, again, we wrestle with, which is the other part of our conversation today, is what this means for the workforce and for work and skills. We won't go through this in a lot of detail, but a lot of what we discussed in the plenary has to do with the fact that, if you look at the different occupations and how they get impacted by technology, it varies quite a bit, mostly to do with the constituent activities that are involved in those occupations. And it's much less of a low wage, high wage question, much more as to what's the nature of the work itself that people are doing. And I think it's also quite important to remember this fact that many more jobs will be changed than will be lost. And I think many more occupations will be affected by that. And I think that's part of what you get when you look at these things from a activity standpoint as opposed to looking at it from a whole job point of view. We know that, as we said, that these activities that are easy to automate are more concentrated in some sectors than others. And we also know that the picture looks different around the world. But, and as I pointed out, at least in some of the research, I think when this question of work comes up, quite often the focus is just on the jobs lost part of it, and not enough conversations on the jobs changed and also the jobs gained. And I think when we balance these things out, at least in the next couple of decades at least, I'm not worried, and many of us are no longer worried as much about this question of a jobless future. But there are other things we should worry about, and this has to do with the transitions that we started to talk about. And it's the transitions that have to do with the fact that because the occupations are going to be different, the mix of them, how do we help people transition from the declining occupations to the growing occupations? How do we deal with the fact that the skills required are going to be quite different? And how do we also think about the fact that we may need to redesign our work environments and systems that people work alongside machines? And then, of course, there's this question about the impact on wages, which I think is one of the more concerning things that we should discuss. I started to show some of these pictures that show the different mixes of declining occupations and growing occupations. And the actual numbers vary quite a bit country by country, and the pictures look quite different. Similarly, when you look at the question of skills, while of course a lot of physical and manual skills largely dominate the hours worked, if you like, in most advanced economies, they will decline. The demand for those skills will decline. At the same time, some of these other skills, such as social and emotional skills and also technological skills, we see the demand for those growing. So how do we deal with some of these skill changes as the transitions occur? And then, of course, there's the wages question, which at a time when we already see wage inequality in most advanced economies, it's quite possible that these technologies may actually make that worse before it becomes easier. So we have to think about this, the impact on wages. And as we talked about before, we don't start in a good place on most of these issues in most countries. We know that there's already skill shortages in most countries. We know that most countries are unhappy about their education systems and don't think that those work very well. And we already know we have an income inequality question. And if you look at trends such as shown on these charts, most countries have actually been reducing the spending on worker training, as well as on active labor supports. And these are typically the supports we provide workers who've been dislocated and are transitioning from one to another. So we're starting in a challenging place in most countries, clearly not all, but some. So these are some of the questions that we thought we might form the basis of our conversation about how do we think about these economic impacts, but at the same time, that we want to embrace, by the way, because they contribute to economic growth and productivity. At the same time, we have these challenges, most to do with skills and worker supports and so forth. How do we navigate these challenges? So with that, I'd like to turn to some of the experts we've got in the room. And I think we're going to start with Mr. Tako, I think from South Korea, to hear some perspectives of what some of the things you've been seeing as you think about these economic impacts, but also these workforce skills challenges. And then we'll call on a few other experts as we proceed.
Good afternoon, distinguished participant and guest. I prepared my presentation about our country's data economy strategy announced recently. So this time is to deliver shortly and briefly introduce our nation's data economy strategy. For having more time to discuss and share each other opinion of the issue and the pending issue about the digital economy, so my presentation will be delivered in a very short time, about 5 minutes. To my and your knowledge, in the era of fourth industrial revolution, data is now the new oil. It is usually said. So now the most valuable resources is no longer oil or traditional assets such as land and capital, etc. It is data, to say is specifically digital data, to be read by the machines. Therefore, In the fourth industrial revolution age, digital data generates economic growth and changes already mentioned, increasing quality of life and paving the way for fairer and more efficient society. And nowadays, digital leading countries, most of the countries around the world, including Estonia hosting the second TDS, have established a nationwide strategy for fostering data-driven economies. And they are earlier aware of the critical value of the data and continuously increase the financial investment in AI, 5G, and IoT, and the future network, and the cloud computing, etc. Today, in our country, Korea, the lack of data utilization systems and the ecosystems have been a stumbling block to the fourth industrial revolution and the data-driven economies. Therefore, it is inevitable to fundamentally change the nation's strategy and the policy shift to the data high-valued data economy for a dramatic change. In such our social and economic context, our government, some ministry related digital economy, such as Ministry of Interior and Safety, and the Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Science and ICT, recently announced a nationwide plan of data-driven economy in May this year. The plan contains a total of 11 initiatives in the 3 strategies. The first strategy is to transform the paradigm of the data utilization systems by strengthening data ownership and accountability, improving laws and systems for more safe and secure use of personal data. The second strategy is the innovation of the whole nation of data value chain, ranging from data acquisition and generation, correct and analyze, to utilizations. It is a focus on building the real data set, each sector, and learning AI data sets, and public sector, as well as the expansion of the public cloud services across all government ministries. The third strategy is to establish the infrastructure for fostering and supporting global level data companies, data businesses, by getting only high technology of data and training data experts and data workforces for the future demands, and nurturing small and medium-sized data businesses. And finally, I'd like to finish my short presentation to suggest the necessity of discourse to guarantee real digital prosperity based on AI technologies. Discussion on the effects of the AI and how to utilize it, as well as how to deal with the security and safety issues that will certainly arise from the whole process to prevent the creation of barriers to the digital economy must take place with a regulatory framework in mind. And I believe that the TDS, which is based on the international cooperation between governments as a good venues to formalize joint international research programs or policy development round the table agenda on regular issues. Thank you.
Mr. Tako, thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear you articulate what South Korea's strategy is and the importance of a data-driven strategy and some of the steps that you're taking and your country's taking to capitalize on that. We'd love to turn to Ms. Jane Lim to hear more, at least how these issues look to you from Singapore's perspective.
Hi, great. Could I have the presentation slides on as well? Right, okay. So I think before I start with, okay, thanks, James. Hi, everyone, morning. So I think before I start with the how we're trying to help our workforce adapt to jobs and skills required in the future digital economy, I think I'd just like to take us back to why we are actually doing this. And I think it's critical that we have to maintain a sense of optimism and confidence in people about what is the impact of technology on their lives and their jobs and on society itself. And I think it really goes back to what we started this morning's plenary session with, which is trust. And we've got to make sure that people trust that there is a system of support to enable them to cope with the digital disruption that's coming. So I think these are trends about globalization and the digital economy that are quite familiar to all of us. So in terms of data flows, I think these are accounting for some increases in GDP that will be far larger than what we have seen before. But one of the things I wanted to point to was also about sectoral boundaries are blurring. So I think in Singapore, we have Grab, which is the equivalent of Uber. In fact, they made the deal and Uber exited Singapore, so now we have Grab. And Grab is not just a ride-hailing app, it's aiming to become a platform. They are into e-payments and food deliveries and I think potentially other verticals as well. I was just in Shanghai and Hangzhou a couple of weeks ago in China, and we were talking to some of the top AI firms there. I think many of you will be familiar with a lot of the advances that they've made in surveillance technologies and facial recognition. But what's interesting now is that as that market is maturing, they're also looking to move into other verticals, such as the use of facial recognition combined with immersive media for entertainment, the use of facial recognition and emotional responses to look at audience responses, again in lifestyle, and as well as in transportation. How do you detect fatigue? Because you have advances in certain facial recognition technologies, you can certainly bring it to many other verticals. So I think that's something that we've all got to be quite aware of, that in fact, we say very often to some of our companies that it's not just the traditional competitors, it's who you don't know who is your traditional competitor who might well become your competitor tomorrow. And so technology is changing the way we do things and transforming business models significantly. So for Singapore, we estimate, this is an estimate done by Microsoft that is estimated to add about another $10 billion to Singapore's GDP growth by 2021. And certainly we are hoping to build from a position of strength today. We have good physical and digital connectivity, relatively easy to do business in Singapore. And as well as for the ICM sector itself, this currently takes up about almost 10% of the GDP in Singapore. And in terms of growth, the ICM sector grew at 7.4% between 2016 to 2017. And that was about double of what the national average growth is. So that's how fast, and really a challenge for us in terms of how do we equip the workforce with the kind of skills that are really in demand. Before I talk about how we actually, look at the supply side of the skills, just wanted to talk a little bit about how we work with industries to actually do digital transformation. So on the left, in Singapore, a couple of years ago, we had a very strong discussion, a very good discussion between government and industry, and that was part of this work called the Future Economy Council for the Future Economy. And so with that, we've come up with 23 different industry transformation maps So it aims to bring what do we do about technologies, how do we grow this industry, and what kind of skills are actually required. So as part of that, for us, one of my roles is really to see how we can support all these different industries on digitalization or digital transformation. We've also got a national program called SMEs Go Digital. So that's to help small and medium enterprises go digital in a very simple, easy to use way, almost step by step, and really just adoption of basic digital technologies. But also at the AI part, since there's a lot of what we're talking about, so we've said that over the next 5 years, we will invest in another $150 million in artificial intelligence. And that's across a number of different projects, experiments, and working with many of our different government agencies, including, for instance, our Smart Nation Digital Government Office, as well as our Economic Development Board and the healthcare authorities as well. And that's probably almost an underestimate because in a lot of other R&D projects, there's naturally going to be AI, but this is a specific initiative that's focused on that. So to support the digital transformation in Singapore, the IMDA has put together a what we call our digital framework, digital economy framework for action. And what it does is to look at 3 different areas. These are what we call our strategic priorities. So first is to accelerate the digitalization of our existing industries for productivity improvements, new revenue opportunities, and efficiency gains. The second pillar is about competition. How do we enhance our economic competitiveness by fostering new integrated ecosystems? And thirdly, to transform. And this is about developing the next generation digital industry as an engine of growth for the economy and to drive digitalization across all industries. And supporting that, I mean, the foundations of this are really what we see here. Talent, I think that's critical. The research and innovation part, policy regulations and standards have to support this as well. And finally, of course, physical and digital infrastructure. So in a nutshell, this sort of puts together, this is a sort of overall framework for action that is helping us build ourselves into a competitive digital economy. Now, turning to actually what does this mean? And I think, James, you had a great point earlier that it's really about not about the job losses per se, but how jobs are actually going to change. And so we've done several deep dives and looked at some of these jobs in the actual sector itself. So for instance, I mean, this just to give a bit of a flavor. So if you're an IT project manager, what could you do? What if you acquired what we call Scrum Master certification, and actually you could take on a new role as an agile IT program manager? So that's in a very real sense how people can actually upgrade their skills. We've got an example from accountancy. So an accountant who undergoes data and analytics training, they could become a financial data strategist. And these are some of the examples of new job roles that we are validating with employers, with discussions with tech firms, and so on. But how do we actually, those are some of the real possibilities, and I think very exciting possibilities. But how do we actually, help people actually get there? So how do we close that skills gap? So in 2016, we launched TESA, which is the Tech Skills Accelerator. So that's a national level initiative that aims at enabling both the ICT trained as well as non-ICT trained professionals to acquire the tech skills to stay relevant in the digital economy. And it focuses a lot on short courses because we're all, if you're working professionals, you don't have that much time to go back to school. Short courses, skill certifications, training boot camps, and on-the-job training programs to help people seize new opportunities. So there are 3 parts. One is about closing the demand, the gap between demand and supply. One is about enhancing the skills for existing professionals. And finally, for people who have been displaced, we also want to put them through training boot camps and help them actually get back into the labor market to place them into relevant jobs. So under TESA, we actually developed a skills framework for ICT. So this is a guide for individuals, employers, and training providers to promote ICT skills. Currently, we've identified more than 80 different skill sets and more than 100 different job roles. So what this does is really to, it serves three different groups of people. I think first is the employers. So employers can use this map to actually look at how do they devise new career pathways and how do they articulate job roles for their own workers. Secondly, it can be used by individuals to guide their own skills identification and figure out what kind of courses they should go for. And finally, of course, to be used by training providers so that they can actually provide courses that are relevant for people. And just in terms of the modalities, there are several ways in which we help to promote the programs itself. So one area is company-led training. And here what we do is that we work with major blue chip companies, one example is SAS, to actually train more than what they themselves will require. So because the idea is that not all companies have the ability or capacity to provide company-led training. So we work with some of the biggest companies to say, can you train more than what you will actually require? And so that allows us to deploy more people into companies that actually require as well. So this is a very structured form of training. It could include a combination of on-the-job training, job rotations, local or even overseas attachments, as well as in-depth training through courses. And I think as part of an active labor market program, all these courses are pretty heavily subsidized by the government. And for those people who are, if you're an existing ICT professional and you also need to upgrade your skills, we have a growing variety of courses, which are short courses that help to support skills in frontier technologies. And so this looks at various, what we call ICT pillars, whether it's the Internet of Things, AI, I think immersive media, cybersecurity, which is a really growing area, and blockchain as well. So I think the approach is that it's not an AI-specific approach per se, but there's a general approach in which we develop skills and economy, and this supports a variety of technology areas. But just specifically because there is such a growing demand for AI skills in the economy, we've recently launched three specific programs, and the aim is to train and educate about another 12,000 more people in AI to acquire AI knowledge. So there are three pillars here. First is a very general course, what we call AI for everyone. So that aims to reach out to students, working professionals, and so on. And that really helps to demystify, it's a very short course, helps to demystify what AI is about, dispel some of the fears, and get people to think about how can you work more productively with AI. Second one is AI for industry. So this is a 3-month AI and data science bootcamp, foundation course, and that helps people get some foundational skills with real-life projects from companies. So you've got to be able to work on real projects and not just take a classroom course. And finally, we've got the AI apprenticeship program. So that's a longer course, and that runs about 9 months. And the idea of this is that it's a full-time structured training program, and we've seen great demand for this as well. So these are just 3 of the ways in which we're helping to equip AI skills for the workforce in Singapore. And just next steps for us, so we launched TESA about 2 years ago, and as of June this year, we've got about 30,000 training places already taken up. And going forward, we are looking to scale this up quite massively, and we will be investing another $150 million over the next 3 years to scale up TESA and really provide more opportunities for skills training for our workforce. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Lim. I'm particularly struck by the very comprehensive framework and the way Singapore is thinking about this, and in particular, the government and private sector collaborations that you described in the very thoughtful way you're tackling the skills question. In fact, maybe in open conversation later, it'd be interesting to see what the experiences have been especially in the larger countries like the UK and France and others, as to how it's possible to actually do these sorts of things in larger countries. Let me turn to Mr. Kapushenko. We have the privilege of having him here, and Taxify is one of the most exciting companies coming out of Estonia. It's one of Estonia's unicorns, but I'd be curious to hear what your experience has been. So turn to you.
Sure. Could I have the slides, please? Yes, AI is a great technology. It shows great promise, but needs more work to live up to its potential. My goal here is to cut through the noise and share where we are. I'll predict what will happen in the next 3 to 5 years based on what we see in our industry and more broadly. AI can be considered an automated decision-making system, and we are furthest in the finance industry, where the large majority of public trades are automatic. In ride-hailing in general, and Taxify in particular, AI has a role to play in increasing efficiencies, accelerating growth, and improving product and service quality. These are the main value propositions of data science, a broader term for applying data in the industry. We see that over the next several years, this discipline will improve growth, efficiency, and quality by double-digit percentage points as a cumulative interest gained over time through incremental improvements. This is one side of AI, improving existing infrastructure. On the other hand, AI is an enabling technology. For example, the onset of self-driving trucks, buses, ships, and cars is driven by AI. We'll see this happen on highways first. In cities and by continents, the adoption will vary depending on the complexity of traffic and roads. In general, this is an example of the capability of technology to automate decisions that take a few seconds for humans. This is what is possible. Overall, it is not yet ready for mainstream use. The best pilot is by Waymo, with 400 daily self-driving rides in Phoenix, in a geofenced area of 260 square kilometers. Automotive is not ready yet. Infrastructure for electric vehicles is not ready, but a lot of progress will be made in the next 3 to 5 years. So to summarize, in the short term, we'll see an increase in productivity and efficiency of companies applying data science, along with growth created by the technology. Economically, many jobs will be automated, but there is always an economic dimension to it. There is a shortage of AI talent. Thus, only a fraction of the most impactful AI applications will be solved short term. Complex motor skills will not be replaced. AI needs good data and good patterns, but life is not about simple data. It is complex. Thus, in the short term, AI will not be applicable to conservative use cases. Many people and companies have only a vague understanding of what AI is. This creates friction and misconceptions, but also opportunities. Let's focus on the last. In general, AI will be humans and machines working together to solve problems neither could accomplish alone. This is the frontier and will be the trend for years to come. Looking forward.
Thank you, Andre. I think one thing that I certainly take away is this idea that it's humans and machines together, but you also pointed out to some of the talent shortages and some of the talent issues. So maybe we can also talk about how do we address some of the talent questions that you pointed to. Let's turn now to Mr. Hermansson from Sweden.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And the impressive programs that we heard of, and Sweden is a small country and we need to increase our pace and accelerate AI. So let me give you a short update on quite hands-on initiatives that's going on in Sweden. I'm the CEO for Lindholmen Science Park in Gothenburg, and the Science Park is an arena for collaborating across borders. And it's currently at home for several of Sweden's leading development projects that focus on mobility of tomorrow. We provide a neutral development environment where players from business community, academia, and society together can conduct major research and development projects. Early this year, we were given a task by the Swedish government to investigate how we can create a national center that will contribute to the acceleration of Sweden's collective competence in AI, complementing already ongoing and planned activities. So in essence, the objective is to gather critical mass to accelerate innovation, and in that also talent is of course a major driver. As we heard this morning, AI has been around since decades, but is now becoming more relevant today thanks to the increased availability of increased data volumes, algorithms, improvements in computing power and storage. Artificial intelligence will change every industry, as we already heard, and we need to understand how and what and within what limits. And the principal limitation of AI is that it learns from the data. It will provide new possibilities for applications where we don't know today the logic or algorithm, but the system can learn by examples. I think, as we also already heard several times, that AI has a great potential to significantly increase the economical growth, as well as contributing to large societal or environmental challenges. Well, I should maybe show you what I brought. So it's my strong belief that the ecosystem here is key, and that an accelerated innovation ecosystem must be supported by the triple helix model. This is quite common way how we try to attack things in Sweden, and this is the interaction between academia, industry and government that foster innovation and development together. University, of course, engaging in research and education, industry in product development, and government in policy making and so on. And putting this together, we think, is the way forward. So the triple helix model of collaboration is common to tackle wicked problems that need competences and resources from all research, product and policy domains. We believe that AI, in fact, is quite suitable for this type of setup, where cooperation in a multifaceted area and with large societal impact. As we already heard, it's applicable in a large number of public and industrial sectors, such as automotive, life science, public administration, and so on. It will be based on fundamental and extensive research. Ethics, democracy issues will be quite important in the long run, legal frameworks, policies, and so on. And it opens up, obviously, for new products and business models. And my task as the CEO of Lindholmen Science Park is to facilitate the triple helix and how we can develop this type of core business. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm also glad you emphasize the importance of ecosystems that include both not just the private sector, but government as well as academia. Exactly. And in fact, some of the most exciting places that tend to be when that is happening. So thank you for emphasizing that. We have several heads of delegation of this group, and I'm just curious to hear some reactions as to how your governments and you're thinking about these questions from your standpoint. And I thought we might start, for example, hearing at least the experiences of Finland, perhaps. Maybe, Mrs. Kajalin, you could give us some perspectives and some reactions to what you've heard, but also how you're thinking about these things in Finland.
Yes, thank you. I think we have quite a lot of discussion of the employment in Finland, how it affects, and how badly, actually, the negative side compared to your presentation earlier today. What was anyhow very positive in Finland was that we have the car manufacturing company which invested a lot to robotics. And based on that one, they created huge amount of workplaces for people putting the cars together, checking that it's in condition and these sort of things. So it in a way created the understanding that the robotics as well, you can continue there to the AI, is giving also new possibilities for the work. Also, I've seen, this is tiny example, but Airbnb, Finland is as well having these opportunities, and there is now small companies who are actually taking care of these Airbnb flats, putting them in condition so that the next one can come and giving the keys. So it has been creating a new working opportunities from that perspective. Generally then, thinking of the education and training, I think that is extremely important. We are also putting efforts on it in Finland. What you need to, of course, know that we are very technologically oriented. Even our Prime Minister is an entrepreneur on this area. So there is a great keen on training, but as well we are by nature, I would say as well, very keen on playing with the different tools in Finland.
I'm actually, one of the questions I always wonder about, particularly in the case of Finland, Finland has had such a great track record of innovation and transformation, but on the training question, maybe we'll come back to it. What have been some examples of effective models that you found working? We've heard the examples that Singapore described, but anything in particular you're thinking about from a skills point of view?
I have to think about it. I will come back.
Okay. Lord Ashton, I'm curious from the point of view of the UK, you know, a larger country. Be curious what your thoughts are on both the economic transformation, but also just on these skills workforce questions.
Yes, there's an awful lot to talk about in everything you said, and one of the things I noticed was you mentioned we're coming from behind in many areas. So if you take things like wages, there are societal issues like fairness and equality. Those are issues that we are thinking about, and we have to take, as politicians, we have to take account of, not just the pure economics of it. Of course, skills is an issue that we've thought about and taken quite seriously. We've just announced a large investment in the AI sector, for example, and skills is one of the areas in that, one of the three sort of main baselines. So going to get a 40% increase in PhDs. We've invested in training in education, and it's part of the compulsory curriculum from a very young age. But we also have to remember older people in our society, trying to get them in touch with the modern technologies and not to be left behind. As far as data is concerned, obviously that's critical. We're launching a program of data trusts, which is a way that we try to get people to share data in a way that's legally understandable, but is equitable as well. So because obviously data is crucial. And one of the ways I think we've been successful so far is by creating a regulatory system which allows innovation, because by and large, regulation doesn't help innovation. But we are aware that you need to have certain areas, minimum standards, and so we are looking at that. And so to advise us on where regulation is necessary, we're setting up an organization called the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation, which will link academia, government, the tech industry, together to advise the government. It's entirely independent and will ultimately be set up under the statute to try and explore the areas and some of the ethics behind how we use this new technology, which, as you've mentioned, is essential if we maintain the trust of the public, because if they don't buy into this, we won't get hold of their data. There are examples of health data, for example, which is obviously one of the most private forms of data you can have, but at the same time has the potential to benefit the whole of society massively. How do we deal with that issue? Another way, going back to skills, we look at the issue of diversity, and it's not just for a political reason or because it's a good thing to do. I mean, that is a way, women are underrepresented, ethnic minorities are underrepresented in high-tech businesses, and we are taking active steps to do that just so that we can access more skills within our own country. We also have, we're increasing the number of visas to allow people. Some people may have noticed we're having an interesting time with the European Union at the moment, but nevertheless, we're very keen that people will be able to come and contribute, and we're aiming for a relationship after we leave the EU, which will enable us to continue on some of the strengths we have. And the issue is really, as your graph showed, in USA and China, and then everyone else is miles behind. So scale is very important. So, for example, we have the Alan Turing Institute in our country, which has already arranged a memorandum of understanding with its French counterpart. So we will need to cooperate, and we're taking active steps to make sure that happens. I could go on, but I'll leave it to somebody else.
Well, but thank you for mentioning these issues of cooperation, particularly when we think about places that are larger regional or economic units, if you like, that could collaborate a lot more. And I'm also glad you mentioned the issues around ethics, because we haven't talked enough about that. But I want to press you on one area you mentioned, because it's one of the things that comes up all the time, these issues of fairness. I certainly live in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and we know that the tech industry there is very male. There aren't enough women in the industry, there aren't enough. So I'm just curious, anything you're doing in particular around some of these issues of diversity and fairness and participation? Yeah, we've introduced something called a Tech Talent Charter for the tech industry generally. And what that says is they sign up voluntarily, and we're getting government are doing it, and also tech businesses, to measurable every year to produce measurable measurements on how this is going. And the idea is it's not just sitting around with a list of things that they should be doing, but we're actually publishing that, and it will create, there's a momentum of, I can't remember the figures, how many have joined up, but it's been good and it's increasing. So that each year we'll be able to show where we're going, and each company will agree to publish those statistics. So it's measurable and it will make a difference. And you know, that's an example of something that you can do, and so far it's been successful. It's in everyone's self-interest to do it, so we want to continue that. That's an example. Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Zavilis. I mean, you're the Vice Minister of the Economy. How do you think about these issues?
Well, if I start from the distance, and I will come to the reskilling and economy topic. I mean, AI, it's a great thing, what's happening, right? But it's, so to speak, not a unique thing. I mean, we have invented electricity, we have invented radios, and many other great technologies that changed our life. So there is definitely the future after this. The only difference between the previous technologies and this one is basically the impact and velocity, or in other words, how quickly and how many people will be impacted. So if, for example, the TV, I think, took us 18 years to reach 50 million users, radio took 70-something years, while there is one technology reached in 35 days, and it was Angry Birds from Finland, right? So we imagine that you can scale the technology super fast. And this is where the difference comes, this transformation or disruption comes. And what I have learned that none of the governments actually invented the AI or the blockchain or any other fancy technology that's currently around. So what does that mean? I mean, we in the government, we try to control top-down what's coming bottom-up. So the lessons I have learned, I mean, don't overestimate or underestimate how this transformation happens. Because even myself, I graduated from computer science. None of the languages I've learned are anymore used in the real world, right? So, and my parents were privileged because whatever they graduated, they kept on working the whole life. But me, most probably, it's impossible. And if we see all those biggest disruptors in the market with AI or just as a digital companies, we see them coming not from the industries. So basically, these are the punks jumping in and distracting what's happening. So this is what I would predict also to the governments. I mean, we either step aside and we learn ourselves what we're talking about, or we are going to be disrupted. So I really liked the Finnish example on the prime minister who basically put the whole government on the education of AI, like for full-time dedication. And this is exactly what we have to do. Then we talk about the digital skills in Europe, because it's not about them, the citizens, the business, it's about us first. How do we understand what is AI is and how can we shape, the future with this? And yeah, maybe talking about the skills, I think this is not yet a one skill or one particular, programming language you have learned. This is basically a digital intelligence that you have educated. You have to understand the whole complexity. What is digital identity, digital security, digital expressions, and many, many other ways how to have a conversation with AI machines and so on. My only wish would be that we do not lock ourselves into this bubble. I mean, I'm excited about this platform that we can share the ideas and what the other countries do, but the whole power comes not us saying, hey, look, we have just developed AI who can distinguish dog from the cat from the pictures, but basically we can go into the industries and solve real life problems. So it's really horizontal, right? And we are just owning the flag to make this disruption, so to speak, in a yet evolutionary way.
Well, Mr. Zvilis, I mean, you make an important point about just the pace of things and how quickly the innovations and to some extent the bottoms-up innovations are moving. I'm just curious in this room whether we think our response systems to this, whether it's in terms of the government responses, are up to speed. In other words, because one of the questions that usually comes up is that on the one hand, innovations are moving very, very quickly, but the response systems, whether it's educational systems or the training or the governments, aren't moving quite quickly. But I'm just curious, I see a lot of nodding heads, but before we, rather make it a general question, I'm curious to hear at least, we've heard from Singapore already, but, Minister, I'm just curious, any other thoughts on this question of how in sync or at pace our government responses? Clearly Singapore seems to be on, all over this issue, but I'm just curious what your reflections are.
Thank you, James. I think I'll just add a few points to what my colleague Ms. Lim had said, and specific to your issue of how we ensure we have the right tools to make sure that we are in sync and that we are responsive. And it's not just governments. We need to make sure that all the players listed in that ecosystem from the colleague from Sweden, the academia, industry, the governments, but also I would add one more, which is the labor movement, our unions and our workers. How do we look at the kind of structures and processes to make sure that all of us are at least informed and in sync with the developments going forward? And I might highlight a few examples that we're thinking about. We talked about Skills Future, which our Tech Skills Accelerator program is a subset focused on the ICT industry. But what we are trying to do with that in Singapore is really mobilize the unlocked value and resources within our academic institutions. So that, it's micro courses, it's weekend courses, it's stackable courses, but really it's how do we make a big shift from undergraduate, teenage learning to adult learning and institutionalize that going forward, so that this wave of disruption is merely an opportunity to put in place something for resilience going forward as the next industrial revolution or the next wave of technology comes. But what that does in its process is it requires our academic institutions to be much more plugged into industry. Because how do you deliver these courses if you're not able to bring industry practitioners into the educational space? And that means that structurally now the curricula, the resources, the programs within our academic institutions are much more industry relevant and are much more likely to remain in tune with industry going forward. Similarly, when we look at the $150 million worth of AI spend over the next 5 years, as well as a lot more on the demand side through other industries, it's coming out through our academic institutions, from our National Research Foundation, through our academic institutions, with a specific structure for private partnerships. Again, looking at a tighter link between industry and our academic institutions. For the labor movement, I think this is crucial. I think it's important to be able to mobilize our unions and our workers around this issue. What we did was we brought them into the process. Every few years in Singapore, we take a good hard look at our economy and ask ourselves what are the structural changes we need to make. So that was the Future Economy Council. And at the table was not just government, not just private industry, but also the trade associations and the labor movement, the unions. So the 23 industry transformation maps that we've come up with have been generated in partnership with all these partners, largely a government response to the asks of business and the labor movement. And what has been their response, and I give you just 3 examples of how, as a result of that participation, they have now responded in a very proactive way. Again, institutionalizing this opportunity to be in sync. The first is they have now mobilized workers and unions to try to not think about mitigating what will happen when AI comes along, but accelerating their own process of change to be ready. Similarly, they have asked to be involved. In fact, they have become very aggressively involved in the process of retraining. So Ms. Lim talked about how we've got company-led training, the private sector involved in training. I've just mentioned about how we're mobilizing academia. And now our labor movement itself is getting involved in this retraining and reskilling for AI and digital disruption. The next area demonstrating how they've become involved is they are now looking to see how they can extend the opportunities for unionization and organized labor to groups that have traditionally been excluded from that process. So PMETs on one hand, the higher level technical skills and professionals, and right at the other end, freelancers and self-employed persons. Again, as a result of which our labor movement will then be far more plugged in to some of the disruptive forces affecting our economy going forward. When it comes to government then, what are some of the structures? Well, we have taken reference from some of the work elsewhere. We have an AI and Data Ethics Advisory Council that we are putting together. But tellingly, this is chaired by our former Attorney General. And it's packed with legal thinking, as well as people looking at some of the insurance issues and regulatory issues. Not so technically heavy. I mean, they have technical resources to call upon. But we believe that some of the rate-limiting steps going forward in maximizing the extraction of value from AI are going to be the ethical issues, the legal issues, and the liability issues around insurance. And of course, there's a commingling of those. There's an intersectionality among some of those things. So, but how do you then make sure that government remains responsive and in sync to all of these things? And our approach has been to use a cliche of the regulatory sandbox, to make sure that we are a place where, and an economy where an innovative business model can be easily and quickly deployed and executed with a few preconditions. The first is that there must be someone within government who will then take ownership of what happens within that regulatory sandbox, and a commitment to some form of regulatory or legislative change going forward. And the example that Ms. Lim brought up, which was the point-to-point sector, ride matching, the matching of resources of the drivers and vehicles to the demand from passengers, was a complete regulatory sandbox. We just didn't have a legislative framework to address this at all, but we didn't then prevent its deployment within Singapore, but we then have to now manage its disruption going forward and develop a regulatory framework around it. So that public sector commitment to how we deal with regulatory sandbox at a very broad level is how we hope that we can get out of the way, but yet have line of sight of what's happening and update our regulatory framework. Because ultimately, we can talk about getting out the way, but once the operating model and the business model starts to achieve some degree of maturity, further progress isn't going to be possible without a strong regulatory framework. And this is applied to disruptions of all sorts throughout history. So we have to take reference from that and create a public sector governance approach that updates that idea for the digital age.
Well, thank you. I mean, the 2 things stood out to me, at least. I don't know if they did to others, about your remarks, Minister Puducherry. One is this idea that, in fact, the workers themselves or the labor movement have to be part of the conversation. And I think the examples you gave of the innovations or even ideas that came from having workers involved, I think was an important part of it. And I just wonder whether, we should have had somebody at this table representing that, but that's a missing voice. But also the other point you made about the importance perhaps of updating regulatory frameworks. And I'm particularly curious, again, to hear from other countries represented here. How do we think the regulatory frameworks work in terms of dealing with the kind of change that we're talking about? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and respond. It's from a different country about that question of updating regulatory frameworks and how well they work. Go ahead.
Well, I think that the coming back to also you talked about or mentioned the talent and the competence development. I think that is the sort of more urgent thing to look into. I mean, since I'm in Gothenburg, we are very close to the automotive industry, Volvo companies both there, and the R&D sector at Volvo Cars, 7,000 people. We have identified 1,200 that needs to be sort of competence transformed in a way. So I think that's the most urgent thing. I think that from a policy point of view, they face the same kind of challenges that we do from a sort of a technical or from a sort of innovation point of view. So I think, again, I think putting this into the ecosystem and work on it collaborative, I think that's still the way forward.
Other comments?
Yeah, I'll just fully agree. And the good thing, that AI popped up so unexpectedly that we haven't had so many laws, written prohibiting it to happen. And the good thing and this is, I think, what we have proved in the past. I mean, technology is such a unique thing. I mean, I've never had an opportunity to talk to someone from Singapore because we would be so distant from each other culturally, well, also by language, but now we have a topic, right? We have an AI and we have a common language. The same with Korea. I'm super excited, right? And on EU level, that's the same. I mean, we have this EU topic on AI, which I think everyone is excited and we are contributing a lot. So I'm personally, as a representative from this smaller country, I count on it that we will come up with the best possible ideas on how we do that on EU level, and then we just scale down to the countries.
Yeah, I think it's very important, really, the regulation part. What we are currently taking to the Parliament is the information management law, which enables the data to flow and supports, from that perspective, also the AI in the future.
Yeah, no, in fact, this issue around data flowing, I think is one that, again, Ms. Lim, you brought up the fact that one of the things that's actually blurring is that the boundaries around data, whether it's by vertical or by country, are actually blurring quite a bit, just given data flows. But I'm just curious how well you think our frameworks and regulations for thinking about that work effectively. Any thoughts from Singapore's experience?
I think, at the risk of sounding, actually at the same time, because I think, James, one of the questions you asked us is actually what is the actual impacts of AI on the economy right now and what are the real use cases that we are seeing. So I thought, the presentations this morning were also very instructive in sort of saying that actually AI is a very specific thing. I think sometimes when we have these conversations about AI, a lot of what is in the popular discourse tends to be about very general intelligence AI. But if you actually look at the real use cases that are coming out, they're really about very specific use cases. And so there hasn't been as much, I would say, a great need to rush in and try to over-regulate as of now. But certainly about things as in autonomous vehicles, I think that's definitely one area in which there's a lot of discussion going on. I think my minister, Dr. Janil, mentioned that we've set up an AI advisory council. And one of the things we've brought together is really industry legal experts, not just from government, but also from Alibaba, Google, Microsoft, because actually a lot of the innovation is happening out there in the companies and in the private sector. And we've got to sort of keep pace with that and understand what the possible implications are, and not sort of overly stifle that. But certainly I think in some of the areas around autonomous vehicles, insurance, finance, that's really one key area that we are looking at. Yeah.
Right. I want to come back as we start to bring this to a close, back to this question of skills and training. One of the things, Andre, and I'm curious whether you have any thoughts on this, one of the things that, the ride-sharing platforms have shown us is this ability to match supply and demand in interesting ways. And I just wonder whether there's a way to take advantage of those capabilities to think about matching the training and skill building that people want with providers of that. But I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around some of these matching challenges when it comes to skills.
Okay. Yeah, overall, technological change is accelerating. Talent is the bottleneck. and scale is different for different companies. US and China different from the rest. Same is true for the companies. The methods and decision-making systems different scale companies use are different. And when it comes to matching, it's a highly multidimensional problem. The main challenge is to define the right goals and metrics for the system. So who defines those metrics and goals, especially if these have a big impact on society and cities. So we work a lot on finding the right ways to describe how we want the system to look like, not just during a day, but over the during the longer course, during a year. In different cities, you have different adoption rates for our technology. So also this has to be taken into account. Right now, on-demand transport is roughly 2% or 3% of the entire urban transportation. It's expected to grow to 25 by 2027. So, which means that there has to be good collaboration between government and companies in the field. So I think there is a lot of work to be done on defining the goals and metrics for urban transport.
No. Thank you. I think as we draw this to a close, there's certainly clearly several themes that came out of this conversation. I think without any doubt, this question about the skills challenge, I think, is clearly a big one. Seems to be important in all the discussions in all the countries and perspectives that we heard. But I also heard a few other things. One is this idea of the importance of ecosystems and collaborations, the fact that, in fact, there are multiple parties who should be and can be involved. And some of the best examples we heard had, in fact, the involvement of multiple participants, industries, innovators, the public sector, but also the workers themselves as an important part of the conversations. This idea also of making sure that we don't forget issues that have to do with trust, inclusion, fairness, equitable thoughts about how to approach these things, as well as these questions about fairness and diversity. I think those clearly are an important part of what we need to think about. But I think it was a good reminder to hear I think, about this importance of pace and how we make sure that, in fact, how we respond to these things is consistent and keeps up with the rate at which change is happening. And also related to that, this idea that we need to potentially update our regulatory and other frameworks to keep up with the pace. But I think many of us, were quite inspired by many of the examples we heard in discussion, whether it was, the examples in Singapore or what Lord Asher was talking about in terms of the initiatives and the UK. But I think I learned a lot in this conversation. So thank you very much for participating.